trade wars, cyber attacks, climate change. In our turbulent world, supply chain disruptions are more frequent and intense. Is your supply chain ready for anything? Find out more about the Resilient Supply Chain Benchmark online, developed and researched by the Economist Intelligence Unit and supported by the Association for Supply Chain Management.
Hi, I'm Abe Eshkenazi, currently CEO for the Association of Supply Chain Management. I'm pleased today to be joined by Claire Casey, the Global Head of Policy and Thought Leadership at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Welcome, Claire.
Hi, Abe. Thanks so much to you and to ASCM for having me today. As you mentioned, I'm the Global Head of Policy and Thought Leadership at the EIU. We are the business intelligence research and advisory arm of the Economist Group, which publishes the Economist magazine, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. For the past 70 years, we have been analyzing and forecasting macroeconomic, politics, policy, and markets around the world, working with businesses, governments, and international organizations to help them better understand and to better navigate the changing world around us. And today, I'm thrilled to be here to talk about the Resilient Supply Chain Benchmark that we created with the generous support of ASCM. We're introducing this benchmark at a time when supply chain resilience is front of mind for not just corporate executives, but also policymakers. We've all felt that disruption in small and big ways. We've developed this framework based on our original resource, but also tapping the insights of some of the world's leading experts on supply chains and specifically the issue of supply chain resilience. And then using the framework, we benchmarked 308 publicly listed US companies in 3 industries: retail, pharmaceuticals, and consumer electronics. And I'm really eager to chat with you today about what we found.
Claire, I couldn't be more excited about this partnership. I think it's going to provide critical information to organizations and individuals on 2 topics that have really started to resonate with almost every company and almost every family across the globe right now, and that is resiliency and sustainability. This has become a hallmark now for associations in terms of sustainability and supply chains. And the discussion right now, has it changed? Has our definition of resiliency, is this a new topic, or what's changed about resiliency that we're taking a look at it through the EIU unit?
Right. So, I mean, certainly the issue of risk in a globalized and complex supply chain isn't new. Managing uncertainty, managing risk, that's always been a core part of the job of a supply chain manager. But today we are seeing something new, and I would describe it as a confluence of trends that together demand a new strategic approach. So the first is what I describe as increased risk exposure in supply chains. So we live in an increasingly interconnected world. We've seen a tripling in the trade of intermediate goods over the past 20 years. And the exponential growth of digital solutions, which we all know have driven efficiency, but have also created new vulnerabilities. And at the same time, we're seeing an increase in both the frequency and severity of supply chain disruptions. So companies are facing a really complex and dynamic threat matrix. They're looking at risks from trade and geopolitical tensions to extreme weather events, cyber threats, volatility and consumer demand, resource depletion, and of course, pandemics. As COVID-19 has made abundantly clear, risks can feed and amplify one another, such that when a disruption does occur, the effects radiate out at a sort of increasing velocity. So historically, supply chain managers have focused on readying themselves for short-term, relatively predictable shocks, and then recovering to a business as usual scenario. That's a scenario that assumes stability is normalcy. And increasingly it isn't. And so in this era of turbulence, that classic approach to risk management, going from crisis to crisis, it simply isn't enough. Organizations need to prepare for a range of upstream and downstream disruptions, from factory fires and floods to dynamic interactions in complex technological systems, or looking forward the uncertain future that we have in front of us with climate change. And they can do this by building greater inherent resilience. Preparing their supply chains to respond to risks, whether they're anticipated or not.
Interesting question about anticipating risk and supply chain professionals. Within their sweet spot is scenario planning, forecasting, and the inherent, sort of risks of forecasts being wrong all the time. It's just a matter of how wrong are they. When we're talking about the benchmark and an organization's ability to not only respond, to the current challenges, but as you're pointing out, to long-term decisions that are necessary to sustain the organization. Where does the benchmark help organizations assess the duality or the contradiction of responding in the short term, but preparing for the long term?
Right, right. And I think it's great that you tied that to scenario planning, because there's huge value in scenario planning, but not to predict the future or to forecast where we're going. All forecasts tend to be wrong, but to test our ability to respond and to sort of map out what could happen. And so what we've done with this framework is discuss and treat two interacting aspects of supply chain resilience. So I think I've already referred to sort of classic supply chain management. I think that's what we would refer to in the benchmark as operational supply chain resilience. So that's really concerned with a company's tactical or operational capability to anticipate, withstand, and respond to a disruption. Recover, bounce back to the normal state of affairs. This is really what we're focused on for real-time, short to medium-term risks. When we talk about strategic supply chain resilience, we're talking about something a bit different, but really mutually reinforcing, which is looking out over that longer time horizon and trying to understand what vulnerabilities we might have over that longer horizon and adapting and transforming our supply chains to that risk environment such that we don't have to be, we can be what we call risk agnostic. We're preparing to respond to manifold different risks because we've built that responsiveness into the system. And there are a number of actions that companies can take to adapt their organizations to this new era of turbulence. Internally, so that's where you're going to start, is there someone in your organization leading on this issue? And are they empowered with sufficient authority, resources, and access to be effective in that role? What might they do? They might look at something like supply chain rebalancing, which could take very different forms depending on the priorities of the organization and its particular strategy. But it could be the regionalization of a supply chain. It could be nearshoring to shorten it and into the market. And again, it really is dependent on the specific goals and market in which that company is functioning. But strategic resilience can't just be built from within. It also needs to involve really actively working with and developing really strong relationships across your supply chain with your suppliers. Not just that first tier, but going deeper into the supply chain. True resilience, we found, only comes when organizations are taking a longer term and more comprehensive assessment of the risks that are embedded within their supply chains and balancing, as you said in the intro, between that real-time, short-term considerations and those bigger, more difficult to predict shocks. The benchmark we created formalizes that interaction, assessing both the operational resilience of a company and its strategic resilience, because again, they're really mutually reinforcing and they're both crucial to supply chain resilience.
Yeah, it's that duality that supply chain professionals, have to, embrace not only the current data, what is it telling you, but how does that affect your long-term decisions? And one of the areas that the focus on the finding was on business continuity plans. And not the fact that organizations, whether it's a binary choice, do you have one or do you not have one, but what is your business continuity plan and how has it been changed or affected by COVID? What do organizations learn? One of the things that we've seen in the past is that often we plan for the last disruption as opposed to the next disruption. So what does business continuity planning look like post-COVID or during COVID right now, because of COVID right now?
Right. So much of this study and so much of what we're learning about business planning sounds like the military. And you captured it right there. We always talk about fighting the last war, and responding to the last crisis or planning for the last crisis is definitely a similar mistake that it is commonly made. So we did look and dig into business continuity plans and playbooks that companies have. We actually asked companies, we surveyed companies that were benchmarked in the index. And we asked them, do they have business continuity plans in place that actually identify specific triggers and then outline steps to take in the event of a disruption? And only 57% of the benchmark companies responded that they have that level of detail in their business continuity planning today. That was shockingly low in today's business environment. We expected that to be higher. But because if you have a business continuity plan, it needs to be relevant and it needs to be actionable. Understanding that this can be burdensome, it can be technically demanding, but it really is necessary to be able to respond effectively in this environment. And what we also learned was that, and this really came from interviews as well, what we learned is that even those companies that did have business continuity plans in place, they found them to be grossly inadequate when faced with a challenge at the scale and scope of COVID-19. So speaking with experts, the consistent finding that we heard was that business leaders quickly became frustrated with the inability of their business continuity management teams to be able to answer the questions they needed in real time. So which teams matter most? Where are they? Which suppliers should we be worried about? Which suppliers are today in a COVID hotspot? Those are the questions they really weren't prepared to answer. And so it's, I think, spurred a lot of soul searching and thinking about how to better be prepared going forward. We're living in this extraordinary moment of a prolonged crisis that is happening everywhere at the same time. And that has really magnified the importance of what we previously thought were non-critical processes. A great example came out of Italy, where in Novartis, I think we all remember in that early phase of the pandemic, Italy was one of the first European countries to be hit quite hard. And what Novartis found was, because of lockdowns and factory shutdowns in those early days, they had this key packaging component that suddenly became a critical material. And that packaging component was aluminum foil. So not something that anyone had ever thought of as a real potential bottleneck in the supply chain. But in that moment, it suddenly became one. I thought it would be useful to take a deep dive into one company that is really at the leading edge of business continuity planning. So when we looked at the results of the benchmark and the survey data, what we found was overall consumer electronics companies tended to be better prepared. And this could be reflective of just the greater risk that they have experienced in the past. But overall, 60% of consumer electronics companies were responding that they had incorporated their suppliers into their continuity planning, and that they had a much sort of deeper relationship with them in this sort of activity. And large consumer electronics companies were at 74%. So those that were making over $250 million a year, that is the dominant behavior that we're seeing. And so we spoke with Dr. Randir Thakur, who's the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Intel. And Intel is really at the leading edge of this. And asked, what are they doing? What's working? And what he told us is that Intel really works directly with their suppliers, not just to understand what's going on in those companies, but also to identify those key sub-suppliers deeper in the supply chain that they need to integrate into their overall risk management plans. They also actively integrate organizational learning and continuous improvement into their business continuity planning. They're codifying the lessons that they learn from a given event or planning activity into their playbooks that they use to guide actual events. They then test those playbooks several times a year with live drills. And the idea there is to build the muscle memory of their executives and leaders in advance of a disruption, so they actually know how they'll need to act. They then take those live drills and incorporate the learnings from them into their planning and processes. So they're identifying gaps and closing them on a regular basis. Those lessons are then shared through the supply chain with their partners to make sure that they're also prepared and operating at the same rhythm. So working with its suppliers in this way, they attribute that to being able to more successfully manage real challenges like achieving zero supply chain related customer impacts after the 2011 tsunami in Japan, the Fukushima incident. And then when COVID-19 struck, they were again able to draw from those past lessons and their exceptionally well-trained personnel to be responsive. So I think it's great. We often focus in these discussions on the gaps and what is left to be done. But I think it's great to also focus on these examples of companies that are really already leading in this space and showing us how we can do it.
No, you bring up a couple of really interesting points and dependencies on an effective supply chain, specifically on visibility. And that's the trust necessary that you need to build with your suppliers, not as a vendor, but as a partner for the organization. Visibility and transparency have taken on critical interest, obviously, with the early warning systems, the scanning and the sensing that organizations are assessing the global marketplace, especially in the global supply chain that we're working on right now. So the benchmark took a look at visibility. How did companies fare on visibility?
So not as well as we would hope, but that gives us room to improve. We looked at visibility into the flow of goods and services in their value chain, looking at how they use data, whether they're integrating supply chain partners into their forecasting and planning activities, and ultimately whether their understanding of demand and flow in the supply chain is inside out or outside in. What we found was that 37% of companies reported that their visibility was hampered by internal silos, so not just external communication, but internal silos, or was not data driven at all. 56% of companies were relying most on internal data to understand the demand and flow within their supply chain, so not engaging externally at all. So what does that say to me? That says there's a lot of room for improvement, but also that 44% of companies have figured out how to engage with outside partners and are gaining from using external data. So there is a path. There are a number of steps that companies can take to build that end-to-end supply chain visibility. And a key step there is integrated systems and better data. And this is not about more sophisticated data. This is really about creating the same, standardizing and having the same definitions for what something is, and to committing to a high level of data quality across the supply chain. So how do we do that? Companies making progress in their own digital transformation need to help bring their suppliers along with us. They can establish data standards and then get their suppliers on board early in the procurement cycle so that systems can be integrated based on what that data means the same thing from one company to another, and even within departments in the same company, which is actually often also a problem. But moving beyond systems, the challenge isn't just there. Benchmark companies across sectors reported that evidence-based decision-making and data literacy were areas really in need of improvement within their own supply chain talent. So that's a sort of a talent and skills development task in front of a lot of companies. And the results varied there by sectors. So the pharmaceuticals sector reported the greatest need for improvement compared to the other two. As supply chains evolve over this decade that's in front of us, data is going to play an increasingly important role, I think we all know, in unlocking new technologies and practices that can build resilience. So whether it's control towers or real-time visibility or stress tests, data is going to be a common building block or a key constraint for companies going forward.
I think we've all seen the investment that organizations are making in their technology, the digital transformation, e-commerce. This has become a critical aspect of organizations. The investment in talent, as you're pointing out, may not be at the same level as the investment in technology. So, from our perspective, working on and with organizations on their workforce, first is that long-term commitment to professional development. It's not a binary switch that you only develop your talent when the market is going well and you're financially stable. That the commitment to your employees is irrespective of market conditions. That's first. Secondly, what we've also seen is that functional competency or a subject matter expert used to be enough. That if you were functionally competent or an SME, that was enough. Now we're seeing the need for collaboration, communication, as you're pointing out, with your vendors and with your relationships. This is outside the walls of the organization. So the challenge for the supply chain professionals is, to your point, on assessing the data and being able to evaluate and discern what the appropriate information is and what do you need to do about it. So I couldn't agree with you more. The investment that's required for talent development is a long-term strategy. That's not a short-term strategy. So in the midst of a pandemic, when data is flying left and right and is bouncing up and down, is this the right time for companies to think long-term when you're in the midst of a pandemic?
Uh, The short answer, yes, it certainly is. We know that COVID-19 is a crisis without precedent, certainly in our lifetimes. And some companies are fighting for their survival right now. And we've seen some market exits, particularly in the retail sector. I think, but with all that understood, it is important for companies to think long term and to balance offensive and defensive moves if they want to emerge from this stronger, and actually prepare not just to get through this and survive, but to thrive in a new environment. There's a lot of learning that's happening in this moment, and there's an opportunity to come out more agile, more able, and more prepared to take on challenges in the future. So one issue that we think is of particular importance is that around the world, some suppliers, especially small and medium-sized firms, are really exposed in this sustained crisis. A lot of the SMEs entered the COVID-19 pandemic already with extremely low working capital. This followed on trends that began after the 2008 financial crisis. Many large companies instituted quite punitive payment terms to help bolster their own coffers, extending out payment terms for SMEs, leaving outstanding invoices unpaid. So what that meant is that many medium and small businesses simply didn't have the reserves or the access to capital to really invest in capabilities that might help them adapt in the midst of this disruption. So those same businesses with lowered financial resilience and insufficient capabilities entered this, and it's a tough moment. They ultimately might close their doors, and their closures will have systemic effects on the supply chain as a whole. Companies need this supplier base when demand recovers. So those who did learn the lesson in the financial crisis came out of that, understanding that they can build their own resilience by strengthening relationships across the supply chain. Some bigger firms we're seeing are attempting to support suppliers. They're honoring their contracts. They're using alternative financing approaches, like leveraging their own credit to provide cash to SMEs more quickly. We found that, again, consumer electronics firms were leading here. Companies size greater than 1 billion, 80% of them stated that they are directly helping suppliers to remain solvent during times of crisis. And that's compared to an average of only 54.9%. So it really is an outlier. And this reflects the deeper risk in that sector. So consumer electronics companies, 39% of those firms responded saying that supplier and partner bankruptcy was a real risk that could cause severe supply chain disruptions over the coming 12 months. That was significantly higher than retail or pharma, which were both under 30%. So it's a cautionary note that we also wanted to add here based on our conversations with folks, not just the survey, which is some companies are finding that when they're trying to extend a hand to their struggling suppliers, but they need to also be coordinating across their own organization. So we've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence that companies have one function that's trying to provide strategic assistance to a supplier, while other parts of the company are imposing onerous burdens and contract provisions on that same supplier. So getting it right internally in terms of communication is also important, but smart companies are getting out there and trying to ensure that their full value chain is going to make it through this moment.
Back to your point about lessons learned and applying them, and a learning organization, really hallmark there. I'm going to take the conversation even longer term, and that's climate change. It seems to have taken a back seat in our current discussions and our current planning. To the question that we had before, now is the time to have long-term plans, not just your short-term resiliency in responding, but how do you engage the discussion on climate change when you're in the midst of a prolonged crisis?
Absolutely. So there is a need to think about these future challenges in the middle of crises. But what's actually so interesting about this moment, and why I think rather than distracting us from climate, it's actually zeroing our focus into climate, is that this wasn't a black swan. The global health community has been trying to raise the alarm about pandemics for decades. We actually at the EIU had released an index called the Global Health Security Index 2.5 months before the emergence of COVID-19, looking at 195 countries' pandemics preparedness. It was on the cover, it was on the front page of the Washington Post saying, raising the alarm, countries aren't ready. There was real urgency around this issue, but it was one of those issues that was so big and the implications of it were so or rather to address it in a really meaningful way was so costly that we sort of looked away. And you could say we've been doing the same thing with climate. And so facing this urgent and very real crisis has actually, I think, created a real call to action around climate. What are we seeing out there? There are some positive signs that there is shifting in our thinking and a greater focus on both sustainability and mitigation, but also resilience in what we know will be a warming world. We've seen recognition that environmental sustainability is a resilience issue. We're seeing that in the investor community. We're seeing that from regulators. They're increasingly penalizing companies for emissions, for environmental damage. The Carbon Disclosure Project looked at the companies that are a member of that organization and are doing their reporting through it. They looked at 8,000 suppliers to its members, and they assessed 1.26 trillion in environmental impact associated with environmental risk. That's in US dollars. So there is a growing recognition, there's a growing movement there. And looking at the supply chain specifically and making it more socially and environmentally sustainable, that was one of the #1 ways that benchmark companies plan to build resilience over the next 3 to 5 years. So that is already top of the agenda. But climate change mitigation and supply chains is telling, just zeroing in on that issue, for how much more action and collaboration is urgently needed. Our benchmark revealed that under half of benchmark companies, so just 42%, had set targets to reduce supply chain related scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 emissions being the emissions associated with the supply chain rather than within the company's footprint itself. And target setting, just setting that goal, that's the easiest part. Then establishing baselines, monitoring performance, and investing in the changes you'll need to actually deliver on that target. That's where it gets a lot harder. So being just at 42% today, we certainly have a lot of room to grow. For benchmark companies, scope 3 emissions data was scarce. Only 16 of the 308 companies that we looked at had scope 3 emissions data available to them. So that really signals that benchmark companies lack the data they need to progress towards their own targets. So a lot of work to be done there. Alignment with suppliers, which we've talked a lot about today, and it sort of helps across the board meet these challenges, can also help here. So we'll get better data and progress on climate change objectives if we have this broader integration of data, and we can use procurement dollars as a lever for getting there. So collaboration from large buyers could also be an approach. So, sort of pre-competitive collaboration among large buyers to establish some consistent approaches with what is largely an overlapping supplier base could also be a really promising approach to achieving this with as little complexity and as little unnecessary expense as possible.
I'm really glad that you connected the climate change to the supply chain, because I don't think you can separate those two concepts, especially on the impact side of it. One of the things that we saw in the beginning of the pandemic was the lack of professionals, specifically healthcare professionals, in the policy and the decision-making on implementation. One of the things that we've seen oftentimes is that we don't have the appropriate professionals in the room, whether supply chain professionals or climate change officers or sustainability officers in the room. So we're providing a benchmark for organizations. What's the best way that organizations and the leaders within sustainability and supply chain and climate change can use this benchmark to help their organizations?
Right. So as you said, we built this to give companies a tool. The goal of this benchmark is to really give evidence-based analysis into those best practices and areas for improvement across industries. So how can companies use it? They can very quickly benchmark their own capabilities in their supply chain management against their industry peers. So that's the sort of first and easiest, quickest way that they can use it. But ultimately, how we hope they'll use it is to build the case within their organizations to invest in more modern supply chain resilience. And in so doing, better position their organizations to face the risks that we all face in a much more turbulent and challenging world and operating environment. So that is the aspiration, that it is a tool for positive change within organizations.
It really is for us, a central moment in terms of providing information on sustainability and on supply chains. We believe that we can have a better world through supply chain, and what you're describing, the things that we're providing through the benchmark, enables organizations to assess where they are, where they can go, and more importantly, put the appropriate plans into place. Claire, thank you so much for sharing this information. We look forward to continuing our relationship with EIU and working on making an impact through supply chain.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating project, and we've been really honored to be a part of it.
All the best.